Thank you for joining me on the Bold Lines podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about socially acceptable emotional affairs. Emotional affairs are not just with people. What we're going to be talking about today are the different ways that individuals use their sense of connectedness, vulnerability, and emotional engagement outside of a long-term relationship or marriage. These are the things or people that we tend to be connected to that bring us a sense of comfort or resolution that keeps us from resolving needed things with our partner. There's a difference between what we are interested in and what steals our emotions. Before we move forward, I will say there is a variation in what an emotional affair is between a new relationship, a long-term relationship, and marriage. There are some different thresholds here in what's considered an affair. If you have been dating someone for a week and you talk to them once or twice a day, and you talk with your friend multiple times a day, it's not an emotional affair. It's a new part of a relationship where commitment is being explored. If you've been with someone for 10 years, and you talk more to a friend than you do your partner, or you're more emotionally invested with that friend than your partner, that's when the conversation of an emotional affair can step in. So what exactly is an emotional affair? When emotions and vulnerability that are needed for a relationship are deferred to something or someone else, you can consider that an emotional affair. If you're wondering what makes an emotional affair, one of the first signs to look for is when someone or something steals emotions from a relationship. When it feels like you should be talking with your partner, but instead you're doing something else. This emotional affair can be more than a person. It can also be a thing or an action. You can have an emotional affair with a person, even if there is no physical or sexual interaction. If you message an ex-partner or a friend or someone of the opposite sex that you could be attracted to, and that person has a greater emotional impact on you than your significant other, that's a problem. If this friend or potential partner or someone you're a little too close to is the person you run to when you feel overwhelmed, sad, or even happy without engagement with your partner, we could consider that an element of an emotional affair. Sometimes a hobby or interest can take over emotional engagement. This is a fun dynamic that I think some people will relate to and some might need a little explanation. You can have emotional affairs with inanimate objects. Sounds a bit weird at first, but follow me here. We talked about emotional affairs are when someone steals away emotions and vulnerability to someone or something else. For those that grew up in suburban America or even rural America, let me ask you, have you ever heard of, or maybe you had the dad who worked on the same car in the garage for 15 years? Anybody who knows anything about mechanics, cars, knows that it shouldn't take 15 years to work on a single car. You're not building the whole thing by hand. So what's happening? That's a way for dad to process, to think through things, to meditate even. The problem comes from, let's say dad comes home, eats dinner, and goes directly to the garage. There's no emotional engagement with anyone anywhere else. That could be considered an emotional affair. What about when someone is going and doing something instead of talking? Instead of going and talking about issues in a marriage, someone might go shopping. Someone might go engage with friends or some sort of activity. Let me give a few examples of how normal things can end up being an emotional affair. An interesting one could be running or exercise. Instead of dealing with issues, people can spend an extraordinary amount of time exercising, running, and quote unquote bettering themselves. If someone spends 2 or 3 hours a day exercising, running, or focusing on health, whatever that is, and only 30 minutes goes towards their partner, I think it's perfectly reasonable to question, so where's all the energy going? Video games is another common one where someone can spend an obscene amount of time playing video games, being upset or interested in them and not their partner. You could also throw social media in there. The other category that I will introduce here can be work. If there's ever been someone who has been so invested in their job that they have no time or emotions at home, we could consider that an emotional affair. Before I move on to which ones are socially acceptable in today's culture, there's an easy thing to ask in all of this. Would your partner or your spouse say, you love this thing or you're more interested in this thing than you are in me? Keep that question in mind. We're going to be coming back to it here soon. So what are some of the socially acceptable emotional affairs? Let's put thoughts and prejudice aside. Let's keep an open mind and see what comes up. In my years of therapy, there is one socially acceptable emotional affair that I see a lot of. Might be just due to my specialty, or maybe it speaks to something larger, but that first category is drinking. When one or both partners drink to have fun and forget, we have a problem. If drinking is a way for you to get away from your problems, to forget, or maybe it's on the opposite end, to actually feel something, I would consider that an emotional affair. Why can't you have that with your partner? Why is it that you can't stop and be still? Why is it that someone only feels vulnerable and begs to be taken care of when they drink? Let's go to one of the more touchy topics in all of this. What about someone who is only interested in sex or is only open to sex if they've been drinking? If you were to step outside of just drinking for a second and say, well, I'm only interested in sex or sexual engagement after I've talked to somebody, that's a problem. Now, I'm not here to demonize drinking. I think drinking can be an overall net neutral. If you actually look back in the past, drinking has provided a very significant benefit to society. Nowadays, it's just a thing, something that can get many people in a lot of trouble. An easy way to see emotional affairs through drinking is when someone comes home and one of their daily rituals is having drinks at the end of the day. I can understand unwinding. I can understand taking a deep breath or maybe having a drink now and again. But if someone needs to have a drink at the end of the day, when they don't address issues or engage with the family and instead defer to something else, I could consider that an emotional affair. I've seen this a lot in my practice. I've even written about it and spoken about it multiple times, where you have a spouse that comes into session and says, it seems like you care more about the bottom of a bottle than you do me. You go searching for the bottom of the glass before you wonder what's happening in your family. I think very rightly, someone can feel like they're being cheated on because of drinking. Now, why is this socially acceptable? For a lot of people, this is just what they've grown up with. Maybe it's what they've seen in movies or even joked about. While those within this kind of dynamic see it as incredibly harmful, they can also recognize that it's very normalized. The next socially acceptable emotional affair that we're going to talk about is work. So many people have gone headfirst into their job or their career as a way to defer from actually having to be emotionally open or present with their family. It's quite interesting to see high level, high functioning executives or people higher up in a corporate ladder be able to see something like money as just numbers. They can take high levels of risk in personnel and finances and projects, but it becomes very, very difficult or even overwhelming for them to be emotionally open with the person they promised to be with for the rest of their lives. Maybe the person you're thinking about isn't an executive, isn't someone high level. Maybe they do extra at work. Maybe they stay later than they need to. Maybe they're so invested in a project that they use it as an excuse to not be engaged at home. This dynamic is incredibly problematic to work through if someone has picked a career field that is intentionally time-consuming or is draining so that they're unable to be present at home. Some clients have gone headfirst into a field that absorbs everything about them, only to come to therapy and wonder why they have nothing left and their partner is threatening to leave them. It's a lot to untangle, but they a lot of times have subconsciously set up an affair system without even realizing it. They can always work, but they can get a new wife. Can't always get a new business. The next socially acceptable emotional affair that we're going to talk about is one that's rather touchy for me. So you'll have to forgive me if I'm on a soapbox. This one is pornography. Interestingly enough, as much as it can be demonized in media, and I personally think there's no good to it, the vast majority of the population sees it as a completely neutral thing. Nowadays, people see pornography as something that's just a matter of life. People do it. People don't do it. What does it matter? For a lot of people that engage in pornography, they see it as a way to have a release, to be able to disengage, to feel something different, to go somewhere else. Instead of engaging with the most intimate act you could possibly engage in with your partner, to be open and vulnerable, to sacrifice, to be able to connect with someone else, they use a screen, which requires no vulnerability. Interestingly enough, people can see pornography as risky because they don't want their partner to find out, which is incredibly curious considering they're more willing to take a risk to be caught and to have to go to therapy and all the fallout than they are willing to take the risk to say, I'm sad and I just feel like I want some sort of connection. Pornography will offer you no risk. You can have exactly what you want, when you want it, how you want it, with whichever kind of person you're looking for to do it. And so it's a very easy emotional affair to have. What is it to risk? Anybody can pick up a phone and find a brand new emotional affair that very easily can turn into a sexual one. For those that are curious why I'm picking a fight with pornography and how it affects people, there's something very, very important to know. In both cases of pornography and in one-night stands, you need to know that your brain responds differently to those situations than it does with sex with a long-term committed partner. In pornography, in one-night stands, the goal is most of the time to quote-unquote get off. We go for large dopamine hits. When people watch porn, when they have one-night stands, your brain releases dopamine, the feel-good stuff. Interestingly enough, when you have sex, vulnerable, open sex with a long-term committed partner, you get a second chemical, oxytocin. It's the cuddle hormone, the thing that makes people feel connected. If you train your brain on dopamine after all of those years without the need for connection, of course your sense of intimate connection with your partner will be different. Of course it will be hurt because you've trained your brain over all of these years that the point of sex is just orgasm. And so emotions and vulnerability can be distant in that way. The next socially acceptable emotional affair is excess or regular use of nicotine or marijuana. While my pot shots at pornography could bring a level of frustration or even vitriol, this category I think could bring some disdain or frustration. I will say, as a therapist, many people don't notice that their emotions are distant in regular or excess nicotine and marijuana use. Think through this with me for a second. If someone's overwhelmed with their partner and they say, I need a smoke, or I need to go have a joint, I need you to sit and think for a second. And with a straight face, tell me that is not taking emotions away from your partner and putting them somewhere else. Because when people go smoke or vape, do they come back and say, okay, so here's what's going on. This is what's really bothering me. No, most of the time they do it just to offload the emotions somewhere else because it seems unreasonable or too scary to do it with the person in front of them. I will say that so much can be hidden underneath psychoactive substances of all kinds. If a drug makes you feel differently, there is a risk that your true needs can be hidden underneath it. If you tell someone that they can't use nicotine or marijuana anymore, and they get highly defensive or angry, there's likely a problem that lies underneath. Now, can this be a self-fulfilling prophecy? Sure. I get the general argument, but if you were to step back and think for a second, why defend something you don't need? What is it that it does for you? What does it stand for? If you have a partner that seems to not be able to quit, are there addictive patterns? Absolutely. But there's a difference between addictive patterns and emotional defending and saying that there isn't a problem at all. There are many people who have simply accepted that you should only have a certain level of emotion with a partner and everything else you can just put somewhere else. And they wonder why things don't end up okay. The last category of socially acceptable emotional affairs is going to be parents and children. Sounds a bit weird. Remember, emotional affairs aren't inherently sexual. They're just putting emotions and vulnerability somewhere else and not with the partner. Good example of this. When a spouse believes they have to compete for time or attention with a parent, with an in-law, with a child, there's a problem. Obviously, there are temporary exceptions to this. When a new child is born, of course, attention, time, and emotion will be driven towards that child. That just makes sense. If a parent has gone ill and a partner needs to go tend to them or their family, of course, there will be a time where emotions are elsewhere. But if that stays indefinite, that's a huge problem. There have been more than one partners in my office that say, it sounds like you care more about what your mother thinks than what I think, or I feel like I'm competing with them. For some people, that right there might touch a nerve. Well, that's good. I mean, the podcast was called Bold Lines. I really hope you didn't expect me to step back and take the easy route here. But if your spouse is competing with your parent, particularly your mother, sorry, that sounds like an emotional affair to me. If you go to this parent or even child, and you listen or talk to them about getting advice, having solace, or getting resolution, it's an issue. You shouldn't be getting solutions to your marriage through your parent. You certainly shouldn't be getting resolution or advice from a child, although it happens a lot. We see it in little interactions where a parent goes to a child and says, what can I do about your mother? Or they'll say, your father is driving me insane, looking for a sense of support. Instead of actually addressing it with a partner who's frustrating them, they go and have it out with the kid. Involving someone who cannot make a healthy and meaningful change in your relationship is wrong. Why would you involve someone who can't actually help? If this person doesn't turn you back to your spouse when there's an issue, they're not helpful. A little aside that I'll throw in here is that, interestingly enough, there's a concept called a pseudo spouse. I've written about this in my book, To Those Left Behind, where a child can take the role of a spouse or a partner when the actual spouse is emotionally unavailable, or They just quote unquote expect too much. So how would you know if something is an emotional affair? I'm going to leave you with 3 questions to consider as we come to the close of this podcast. Does your partner or spouse rightfully complain about you being with or engaging with something else more intimately than them? Do you find yourself caring more about a situation or experience than your partner? The last question is, I want you to ask yourself, who or what would be most upsetting to lose? If it's not your partner, maybe it's time to reevaluate your priorities and your relationships. Thank you for listening today. I hope that you got something useful out of the podcast. If you found it to be something particularly helpful, I hope that you follow to get regular updates on Tuesdays. Share this episode with those around you, and if you feel so inclined, help pay for the production of this podcast by providing something in the tip jar. You're also welcome to submit a question to the podcast. I will devote an entire episode to questions that viewers submit. Thank you so much. Have a great day.